we are, I think it's fair to say, we're completely terrified of missing out on, the real secret to unlocking our potential.
Oh, absolutely. It's just human nature at this point.
Right. Like you see it everywhere. Just think about buying an absolute top-of-the-line flagship smartphone today.
Yeah, the ones that cost a fortune.
Exactly. It possesses this incredibly advanced camera, a processor that basically rivals most desktop computers, a super secure operating system. I mean, the engineers spent billions ensuring it is entirely self-sufficient right out of the box.
But that's never enough for us, is it?
Never. What do? We immediately start downloading these, sketchy third-party apps.
Yeah.
We buy weird aftermarket chargers that end up frying the battery.
Right, or slapping on these clunky accessories.
Yeah. Because someone on the internet convinced us that the phone, just on its own, wasn't quite enough. We have this fundamental, deeply ingrained distrust of sufficiency.
We really do. We inherently prefer complexity over finished sufficiency.
Which is wild, but true.
It is, because complexity allows us to feel like we're actually contributing to our own security. We want to add our own effort, our own secret little ingredients, so we can feel like we possess an edge that the uninitiated just don't have.
Oh, that's such a good way to put it.
And that instinct, that specific psychological vulnerability, is the driving conflict behind the material we are examining today.
Yes. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are diving into a massive, incredibly detailed stack of sources today. We've got a rigorous set of Master of Divinity lecture notes that dissect one specific ancient letter, the New Testament epistle to the Colossians.
It's a fantastic set of notes, very thorough.
Super thorough. And our mission today is to bypass the sort of surface-level reading you might do in a quick Sunday school class. We want to look at the ancient Greek, the historical crisis that forced the author's hand, and really how this specific document was engineered to cure that exact anxiety of not enough.
Right. And it's important to note for you listening, our sources approach this text from a conservative evangelical perspective.
Which means what, exactly, for our workflow?
It means we're looking at a primary source, heavily exegetical workflow. We're going to analyze the text exactly as these seminary scholars have laid it out, digging into the historical grammar to understand its overarching theme, which is
the absolute supremacy and the total sufficiency of Jesus Christ.
Exactly. Yeah. That is the heartbeat of this entire letter.
So to grasp why a letter defending the sufficiency of Christ was even necessary in the first place, we have to start with the background, the Sitz im Leben.
The setting in life.
Right.
The internal evidence, which our sources heavily emphasize, establishes the physical reality of the authorship. The Apostle Paul is writing this letter, and he's accompanied by Timothy.
Who's acting as a scribe, right? And amanuensis.
Yes, exactly. And the dating places this composition roughly around AD 60 to 62. But the crucial context here, the thing you really have to picture, is the environment. Paul is under house arrest in Rome. He is waiting for trial before the emperor.
Which is just a terrifying prospect on its own.
Completely. And he explicitly mentions his chains in the text. He uses the Greek word dysmoi. So we are looking at a man who is physically restricted. He's likely chained to a Roman Praetorian guard in rotating shifts.
Which is just an incredible irony when you think about it. The guy in literal physical chains is writing the ultimate manual on cosmic freedom.
It is a staggering contrast.
It really is. And what makes this even more fascinating reading through these notes is the relationship Paul actually has with the recipients of this letter. Because he didn't plant the church in Colossae.
No, he didn't. In fact, he explicitly states in the letter that he has never even seen their faces.
Wow. So how did they get the gospel?
The gospel was brought to Colossae by a co-worker of Paul's named Epiphras.
Epiphras.
Yeah, and this likely occurred during Paul's extended 3-year ministry in Ephesus. So this would be roughly a decade earlier, around AD 52 to 55.
Ephesus was like the major metropolitan hub of that region, right?
Exactly. It was the center of gravity. So Epiphras seemingly heard Paul's message there in Ephesus, took it back to his hometown in the Lycus Valley, which is where Colossae is, and he planted this church.
Okay, so Epiphras plants the church, but now it's a decade later.
Right. And Epiphras has undertaken this massive, incredibly dangerous journey across the ancient world. He travels from modern-day Turkey all the way to Rome.
Just to find Paul.
Yes. He sought out Paul, who is under Roman house arrest, specifically to deliver a distress signal.
Because things in Colossae were just going entirely off the rails.
To put it mildly, yes.
And to understand that distress signal, you have to look at the cultural geography of the city itself. Because Colossae wasn't just some sleepy little village. The sources describe it as this intense cultural melting pot. It created an ideological blender that I think is almost hard for our modern minds to fully appreciate.
It really was. The Lycus Valley was this pluralistic, highly commercial hub. It was situated directly along the major east-west trade routes.
You constantly have people moving through.
Exactly. A continuous, heavy flow of contrasting worldviews. First off, you had the native Phrygian population.
And what was their sort of religious vibe?
Their religious landscape was deeply rooted in animistic folk traditions. They had mystery cults devoted to local deities like Spalae, and there was a heavy, heavy focus on ecstatic visions and trying to appease unpredictable nature spirits.
Okay, so lots of spiritual anxiety there.
Huge amounts. But then, added to this, you had a massive Jewish diaspora community.
Right, because decades earlier, Antiochus the Great had relocated, what was it, thousands of Jewish families into that region.
Yes, thousands. And they brought with them strict ethical monotheism, the Mosaic Law, strict dietary restrictions, and a rigid festival calendar.
So you have animistic folk religion bumping right up against strict Jewish legalism.
And if that wasn't enough, arching over all of this, you had Greco-Roman paganism, you had the imperial cult worshiping the emperor, and you had these emerging proto-Gnostic philosophical ideas.
Proto-Gnostic meaning?
Meaning they viewed the material world, the physical stuff, as inherently corrupt and bad, and the purely spiritual realm as good.
So you throw animism, strict Jewish legalism, and Greco-Roman philosophy into one city, and you get the perfect breeding ground for what scholars label the Colossian heresy.
The ultimate toxic theological soup.
Exactly. And reading through these seminary notes, this is the concept that forces a real paradigm shift. Because when you or I hear the word heresy, we typically envision a group standing up and declaring, Jesus never existed, or Jesus was just a political revolutionary, not God.
Right, an outright denial.
Yeah. But the heresy threatening Colossae wasn't a flat-out denial of Jesus at all.
No, and that's what made it so insidious. Outright denial is easily identified. You can easily combat it. The Colossian threat was a dangerous syncretism.
Syncretism, meaning the blending of things.
Yes, the blending of disparate religious or philosophical beliefs into a brand new, compromised, hybrid system. The false teachers infiltrating the Colossian church were perfectly happy to include Jesus in their theology.
They weren't anti-Jesus.
Not at all. They simply treated him as the baseline. They argued that, sure, believing in Jesus was a fine starting point, but it was inadequate for ultimate cosmic security.
Okay, I want to jump in here because I think modern diet and wellness culture is like the perfect parallel for
Oh, yes, absolutely. Unpack that.
Okay, so you start with a basic healthy lifestyle.
Right.
You're eating whole foods, you're getting some exercise. That is your baseline. It's sufficient. But then the wellness gurus on social media intervene.
Right, they show up in your feed.
And they tell you, hey, eating vegetables is fine for beginners. But if you really want to achieve like cellular fullness, if you want to completely detoxify and reach elite biological optimization, you need this proprietary $200 mushroom supplement.
You need our specific brand.
Yes. You need an extreme 36-hour intermittent fasting protocol. You need to sleep on a grounding mat. They take a perfectly sufficient foundation and they weaponize your anxiety by telling you it's simply not enough.
The psychological manipulation is completely identical. The false teachers in Colossae were basically telling these new believers, listen, Christ is wonderful, but the universe is vast, it's layered, it's terrifying. There are intermediary spiritual beings, angels, and elemental spirits of the cosmos out there.
And they might get you.
Exactly. So to truly achieve spiritual fullness and guarantee your protection from these unpredictable cosmic powers, you need supplemental requirements.
The spiritual grounding mats.
Exactly. So they demanded strict adherence to Jewish dietary laws. They demanded ascetic self-mortification.
Which means what? Punishing the body.
Yes, physically punishing the physical body to achieve spiritual purity. Fasting to extremes, that sort of thing. They also demanded the veneration or even the worship of angels to ensure a safe passage through the spiritual realm. They were taking the finished historical work of Christ and just appending a massive but to it.
This is great.
Yes.
And Paul recognized that but as an absolute existential threat to the gospel itself. Because if Christ requires supplementation, then by definition, he is not supreme.
He's just a stepping stone.
Right. So this syncretistic anxiety required a brilliant authoritative response. And what I love about this letter is that Paul didn't just fire off an angry, unhinged rant. He architected this letter.
He really did. It's a masterpiece.
The sources break down the literary and rhetorical structure of Colossians, and they show how Paul uses established conventions of Greco-Roman moral exhortation to dismantle the heresy piece by piece.
And the academic term for this rhetorical strategy is paranesis.
Paranesis.
Yes. In the Greco-Roman world, philosophers like Seneca or Epictetus used paranesis not merely to transfer data to someone's brain, but to actively shape the moral conduct and the fundamental worldview of the recipient.
So it's heavily persuasive.
Highly persuasive. And Paul adopts this framework, but he infuses it with deep Christian theology. The notes identify 4 distinct logical building phases in the macrostructure of the letter.
He constructs his argument almost like a fortress.
That's a great analogy. So, chapter 1 is the doctrinal phase. He builds downward. He is establishing the absolute bedrock foundation of Christ's eternal, uncreated nature, because you cannot defend against a cosmic threat until the foundational reality of who Jesus is has been completely secured.
Right. And then, once that foundation is poured, chapter 2 moves into the polemical phase. He starts building upward.
This is where the fight happens.
Yes, this is where he directly attacks that syncretic heresy, proving that believers already possess total sufficiency in Christ. He is walling off the external threats.
Exactly. Then, chapter 3 initiates the practical phase. He builds inward, focusing on the psychology and the spiritual disciplines of the believer.
And finally, chapter 4 is the behavioral phase. He builds outward, dictating how this internal transformation demonstrates grace to the watching world through your labor, your speech, and your social dynamics.
Downward, upward, inward, outward. The genius of the structure is anchored entirely in that first phase, the downward build. The absolute centerpiece, the jewel in the crown of the doctrinal section, is the Christ hymn found in Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20.
And the lecture notes point out something amazing here about the Greek text. When scholars look at this in the Nestle-Allen 28th edition, the standard Greek text, they immediately note a really jarring shift in literary style right at verse 15.
Oh, yes. The prose completely changes.
The text transitions into this elevated, highly structured rhythmic prose. It is widely recognized as an early Christian hymn or a piece of liturgy that Paul either composed himself or adapted specifically for this letter.
And the structure of the hymn itself is a weapon.
How so?
Well, the first stanza focuses on Christ as the sovereign Lord of the original creation. Then the second stanza mirrors it, focusing on Christ as the sovereign Lord of the new creation, which is the church. And running through the entire poem is this deliberate pounding drumbeat of the Greek phrase, tapanta.
Tapanta, meaning all things?
Yes. It just repeats over and over. By him all things were created. He is before all things. In him all things hold together, to reconcile to himself all things.
It's just relentless.
It is a rhetorical sledgehammer. Paul is leaving absolutely zero room for intermediary angels or rogue cosmic spirits to claim any jurisdiction, because if Christ created Tapanta, and he sustains Tapanta, then the false teacher's obsession with appeasing lesser spirits is fundamentally absurd.
Because Jesus already owns them.
Precisely.
And the notes reveal something even more subversive happening in the Greek text here.
Yeah.
Paul isn't just asserting theological propositions in a vacuum. He is actively hijacking the vocabulary of the false teachers.
Oh, this is my favorite part of the letter.
It's so good. He takes their favorite, most intimidating buzzwords and completely disarms them. Let's look at the word pleroma.
Right. So in the syncretistic, proto-Gnostic soup of the first century, pleroma translates to fullness.
Fullness, okay.
And remember, Hellenistic cosmology often viewed the material world as corrupt and distant from the pure, transcendent divine.
God is far away and pure. Matter is close and dirty.
Exactly. So to bridge this massive gap, they imagined a vast hierarchy of emanations, angels, and spiritual buffer zones. The pleroma was the collective sum of all those divine powers scattered across the entire cosmic hierarchy.
Like the whole spiritual bureaucracy.
Yes. So the false teachers were intimidating the Colossians by claiming, listen, you only have Jesus, but we know how to navigate the entire pleroma.
We know the passwords to the whole system.
Exactly.
And Paul basically steals the word right out of their mouths. In Colossians 2:9, he writes, "For in him," meaning Jesus, "the whole pleroma of deity dwells bodily."
It's brilliant.
He takes this vast, terrifying cosmic concept of divine fullness that supposedly spans the entire universe, he shrinks it down, and completely localizes it inside the physical, incarnate body of a first-century Jewish carpenter.
Yes. He tells the church, you don't need to go searching through the cosmos. You don't need to appease some hierarchy of angels. The entire fullness of God is sitting right in front of you. If you have Christ, you have the pleroma.
It's total theological judo.
It really is. He uses their own momentum to flip their argument on its head. And he executes the exact same maneuver with the Greek word mysterion.
Which means mystery.
Right, but not like a murder mystery. In the Greco-Roman mystery cults like the Eleusinian mysteries or the Mithraic cults, a mysterion was a heavily guarded secret teaching.
It was exclusive.
Highly exclusive. It was reserved for the elite, the initiated few who had paid their dues, performed the extreme ascetic rites, and climbed the spiritual ladder.
And Paul takes this concept of the elite, VIP mystery, and he completely democratizes it. He announces in chapter 1 that he has been commissioned to reveal the mystery that has been kept hidden for ages and generations, but is now disclosed to the Lord's people.
And the punchline is incredible.
Right. The ultimate cosmic mystery isn't an esoteric password or a secret handshake you learn after fasting for a week. The mystery is Christ in you, the hope of glory. The greatest secret of the universe has been freely distributed. It is currently dwelling inside every single believer, regardless of their social status, their education, or their ability to perform some intense ascetic fasting.
And by democratizing the mystery, he completely short-circuits the elitism of the false teachers, because they derived their power by acting as gatekeepers to the divine.
You have to go through us to get the secret.
Right, and Paul just shatters the gate. But his brilliance here isn't restricted to just clever Greek wordplay. These MDiv notes heavily emphasize that Paul's argument relies on a really profound intertextuality.
Meaning he's referencing other texts?
Yes. He is anchoring his defense deeply in the ancient Hebrew scriptures.
Which brings up a fascinating structural oddity in Colossians. If you read the letter from start to finish, Paul never actually formally quotes the Old Testament.
Not once.
There is no, as the prophet Isaiah says, or thus says the Lord, yet the entire letter is completely saturated with Old Testament theology. He weaves the Hebrew scriptures into his argument through allusions, through echoes, and conceptual mapping.
He takes the entire storyline of Israel and recontextualizes it to exalt Jesus.
And the sources highlight 3 massive intertextual connections that really serve as the load-bearing pillars of his argument.
Let's unpack those. The first one requires turning all the way back to the opening page of the biblical narrative. Genesis 1 and the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God.
Right.
In Genesis, humanity is created in God's image. The Hebrew text uses the words selim and demut. And we have to understand this in its ancient context. In the ancient Near East, conquering kings would place physical statues, images of themselves, in conquered territories.
Because they couldn't physically be everywhere at once.
Exactly. So the statue represented their sovereign presence and their authority in a place where they were not physically present. So humanity was designed by God to be the visible representative of the invisible king. We were meant to reflect his rule into the material world.
But the biblical narrative obviously demonstrates that humanity fractured that image through rebellion. We became essentially broken mirrors distorting the reflection of God.
Yes. But Paul looks at Jesus, and in this letter he deploys the Greek word icon. He declares that Christ is the icon of the invisible God.
And he isn't just saying Jesus is merely a human who happens to reflect God nicely, right?
Yeah. No, he is making a staggering ontological claim. Christ is the definitive realization of the image that Adam failed to uphold. In the Greco-Roman world, an icon like the emperor's face stamped on a coin or a statue in a provincial forum was legally treated as the actual presence of the emperor himself.
So Paul is declaring that Jesus is the visible, tangible, historical manifestation of the transcendent, invisible Yahweh.
Yes. To look at Jesus is to look directly at God.
He is the ultimate perfect human fulfilling the vocation of Eden while simultaneously being fully divine.
Exactly. And this seamlessly connects to the second major Old Testament echo, which is drawn from Proverbs 8 and the concept of chokmah, or wisdom.
Okay, set the stage for Proverbs 8 for us.
So in Proverbs 8, wisdom is poetically personified. She describes herself as existing before the world was made, acting as a master craftsman working alongside God to architect the cosmos.
Okay.
The writer of Proverbs was using poetry to establish that the universe isn't just random chaos. It possesses a deep moral and structural integrity based on God's wisdom. And Paul takes this poetic personification of divine wisdom and he maps it directly onto the historical person of Jesus.
Wow.
And in doing so, he calls Jesus the prototokos, the firstborn over all creation. creation.
And we have to pause here,
Okay.
because that word, kodotokos, has been the epicenter of massive historical controversies. The seminary notes are meticulously careful to clarify the conservative evangelical perspective here, because misreading this single Greek word birthed one of the most destructive theological crises in church history.
It really did. It triggered the Arian controversy, which eventually culminated in the Council of Nicaea in AD 325.
Right, so what was Arius arguing?
Arius and his followers pointed to Colossians 1.15. They looked at the word firstborn, and they applied a strictly chronological, biological definition to it.
Like, I was born first in my family.
Exactly. They argued that if Jesus is the firstborn of creation, it means he was the very first being that God ever created. Their famous slogan was, "There was a time when he was not."
Meaning he wasn't eternal.
Right. They believed Jesus was a highly exalted creature, maybe the highest creature, but not eternal, uncreated God.
But the Orthodox scholars in these lecture notes argue that Arianism represents a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of how the ancient Hebrew mind conceptualized the title of firstborn.
It really is a category error. In the Old Testament framework, firstborn rarely denotes chronological birth order. Instead, it functions as a legal title. It denotes primacy of rank, supremacy of status, and the right of ultimate inheritance.
Could you give an example of that?
Absolutely. The definitive proof text is Psalm 89, verse 27. God is speaking concerning King David, and he says, "I will also appoint him my firstborn, the most exalted of the kings of the earth."
But David wasn't the firstborn chronologically.
Not even close. Historically, David was the youngest of Jesse's 8 sons. He was the runt of the litter. Chronologically, he was the lastborn. Yet God appointed him to the status of firstborn, the supreme heir and ruler.
Ah, so when Paul calls Jesus the prototokos of creation, it has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus being created. It is a declaration of absolute sovereignty.
Exactly.
Jesus holds the legal title deeds to the entire universe.
Yes. He is the sovereign heir over the created order existing outside of it.
That clears up so much. Now, the third intertextual connection strikes directly at the legalistic demands of the false teachers. And this draws heavily on the prophetic traditions of heart circumcision and the new Exodus.
Right. Because remember, the false teachers were intimidating Gentile believers, insisting that physical circumcision and adherence to the Mosaic law were mandatory prerequisites for true spiritual safety.
You have to become Jewish to be a real Christian.
Exactly. And Paul counters this by pulling from Deuteronomy 30 and Jeremiah 4. The ancient prophets recognized that the physical covenant marker on the flesh was ultimately powerless to change a rebellious human heart.
Right, the external ritual couldn't fix the internal problem.
Exactly. So they pointed forward to a future eschatological day when God would perform a circumcision of the heart, a radical internal spiritual transformation. And Paul announces to the Colossians that this prophetic future hope has already crashed into the present moment.
In Colossians 2.1, Paul writes, "In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands." He argues that physical surgical modifications are totally obsolete now.
Yes, the spiritual reality the prophets long for has been achieved entirely through the believer's union with Christ's death and resurrection. The external ritual is entirely superseded by internal spiritual regeneration.
The lecture notes provide an incredibly vivid analogy for this, looking at Colossians 2, verses 16 and 17. It is the shadow versus substance paradigm.
Walk us through that one.
Okay, so imagine you have been separated from someone you love deeply, and you are waiting on a street corner for them to arrive. Suddenly, the angle of the sun casts their long shadow around the corner of a building. You can see the outline of their shape approaching.
Okay, I picture it.
What do? Do you run up and throw your arms around the shadow on the pavement? Do you sit down and try to have a conversation with the shadow?
Of course not.
No. The shadow is merely a two-dimensional predictor. You wait for the actual three-dimensional person to step around the corner, and you embrace the physical substance of who they are.
The pedagogical power of that illustration is immense.
Yeah.
Because Paul is informing the Colossians that the entirety of the Old Testament dietary laws, the festival calendars, the new moons, the Sabbaths, they were all divinely ordained and purposeful.
They weren't bad.
No, not at all. But they were shadows. They were the outline cast backward into history by the approaching massive reality of Jesus Christ. Christ is the physical substance.
Yes.
So the argument is devastatingly logical. To bind believers to the shadow when the substance has finally arrived is a massive spiritual regression. It is absurdity to hug the shadow on the pavement when Jesus is standing right in front of you.
It makes so much sense. You don't need the dietary laws to make you clean. Jesus makes you clean.
Exactly.
But, and this is but establishing that Jesus is the substance doesn't automatically solve the psychological terror the Colossians were feeling regarding the spiritual realm.
No, it doesn't.
Because the false teachers had them convinced that if they didn't follow the rules, the cosmic powers would exact vengeance. So how does identifying Jesus as the creator actually solve their very real legal terror of cosmic punishment?
That tension forces us right into the central nervous system of the letter, cosmic Christology and radical reconciliation. Notice that Paul does not just wave away their fears by claiming the spiritual realm doesn't exist.
He doesn't say, oh, demons aren't real.
Right. Instead, he explains the exact objective legal mechanics of the cross to prove that the spiritual powers have been permanently neutralized.
And this is where we really have to abandon the modern, sanitized view of the cross as merely an inspiring example of divine empathy.
It's so much more than that.
It wasn't just a demonstration of love. Paul frames it as a brutal, objective, legal transaction.
The vocabulary Paul employs in Colossians 2.14 is pulled straight from ancient legal and financial tribunals. He states that God forgave our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands.
The Greek word for record of debt there is cheirographon.
Cheirographon, yes. And in Roman law, a cheirographon was a handwritten certificate of indebtedness. It was an IOU signed by the debtor in their very own handwriting, acknowledging exactly what they owed.
So Paul argues that every human being possesses an infinite, insurmountable cheirographon, documenting our cosmic treason against a holy God.
And we signed it.
We signed it. The debt is real, and the legal demands are entirely valid, and this is exactly where the demonic powers derive their leverage over us. Satan's primary weapon is not pitchforks and fire. It is accusation.
Yes. The demonic realm operates like cosmic prosecuting attorneys. They hold up the cheirographon and demand our execution based on our own documented guilt.
Which is why Paul's next phrase in the text is so explosive. He says, Christ took this valid, condemning record of debt and set it aside, nailing it to the cross.
And again, the historical context here is crucial. Under Roman law, when a criminal was crucified, the specific legal charges warranting their execution were written on a wooden placard, the titulus.
Like the sign above Jesus, it said, King of the Jews.
Exactly. That titulus was nailed to the cross above their head to show the public exactly what the legal debt was. Paul fuses these two images together. He says the infinite damning IOU of humanity's sin was taken by Christ, transferred to his own account, and nailed to his cross.
He absorbed the ultimate legal penalty in his own flesh, paying the debt in full.
And because the debt is paid in full, the account is completely bankrupted. The legal demands have been entirely satisfied.
Which means the demonic prosecuting attorneys are left standing there, holding an empty folder.
Exactly. They have absolutely nothing left to accuse the believer with.
The case is thrown out.
Paul confirms this in verse 15. Having bankrupted their legal claims, Paul says Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him.
And the imagery here is the Roman triumphal procession, the triumphus.
Yes, and the historical context of a Roman triumph is incredibly savage.
Paint that picture for us.
So when a Roman general achieved a massive, decisive military victory, the Senate would grant him a triumph. He would ride into Rome on a 4-horse chariot down the Via Sacra, crowds cheering, incense burning. But the most crucial element was what happened to the defeated enemies.
Right.
The conquered kings and opposing generals were stripped of their weapons, they were stripped of their dignity, they were bound in chains and dragged behind the chariot through the streets of Rome, making a spectacular public mockery of their absolute defeat.
It was total humiliation.
Complete subjugation. And Paul takes the most vivid image of absolute military domination available in the first century world, and he applies it directly to the demonic realm.
He tells the Colossians that at the cross, the moment that looked like Christ's ultimate defeat to the naked eye, he was actually riding in a cosmic chariot.
Yes.
He stripped the stoichia tu cosmou, those elemental spirits, of their only weapon, the power of accusation. He paraded the demonic powers in chains, putting them to open shame.
It is a stunning reversal.
Okay, but wait. I have to push back here.
Go for it.
If the legal debt is permanently bankrupted and the cosmic powers are paraded in chains, if the war is decisively over and won, why does chapter 3 read like a grueling moral to-do list? Isn't Paul just replacing the false teacher's legalism with his own brand of Christian legalism? Why the massive shift from "it is finished" to put to death your flesh.
That is the most crucial transition in all of Pauline theology. The seminary notes identify this as the exact pivot from orthodoxy, which is right belief, to orthopraxy, which is right practice.
Okay.
Paul is fiercely arguing that true Christian ethics, how you actually behave on a mundane Tuesday morning, are not about adhering to external rules to earn God's favor or to appease spirits.
Which is what the false teachers were doing.
Exactly. The false teachers used external rules to achieve a status. Paul commends ethical behavior as the organic, necessary outworking of a status that has already been permanently secured.
The sources define this as resurrection discipleship.
Yes. And Paul establishes the foundation for this in Colossians 3:1. He says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above."
And the notes clarify that the Greek conditional phrasing here isn't a hypothetical if. It implies a fulfilled reality, since you have been raised with Christ.
Exactly. The entire engine of Christian behavioral change is union with Christ. Because Jesus died and resurrected, and because the believer is spiritually grafted into him, the believer has fundamentally died to their old nature and been resurrected into a new creation.
So Paul's commands are not try harder to be a good person.
No. His commands are become who you already are. Your behavior must align with your new ontological reality.
And he provides the actual mechanics for this transformation using these vivid clothing metaphors. In the early church, when someone was baptized, they would physically strip off their old dirty clothes, descend into the water, and upon coming out, they would be clothed in a pure white robe.
Right, a visual representation of the internal change.
So Paul leverages this imagery. He says we must deliberately put off. The Greek is apothemath, the old self. We have to strip off vices like anger, wrath, malice, slander, and sexual immorality, like a set of filthy, contaminated garments. You do not manage or negotiate with these behaviors. You discard them entirely.
But discarding the negative is insufficient on its own, because nature abhors a vacuum. You must replace the old garments.
Right.
So Paul commands believers to NDS, to clothe themselves. We are to deliberately put on the virtues of Christ: compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, and love, which he says binds them all together in perfect harmony.
Which totally dismantles the asceticism of the false teachers. Because in chapter 2, Paul notes that severe external discipline of the physical body is of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh.
You cannot legislate the human heart into holiness.
Beating your body will not cure your pride.
Exactly. Transformation requires the internal, organic fruit of knowing you are totally secure in Christ.
You cannot beat the sin out of yourself. You have to crowd it out with the beauty and sufficiency of Christ.
Beautifully said.
And this theological reality doesn't just remain in the abstract spiritual realm. It forcefully collides with everyday social dynamics. The expert notes dedicate significant time to unpacking how Paul handles the Greco-Roman household codes.
Known academically as the Hostafel.
Right, the Hostafel.
And the Hostafel reveals the radical, completely subversive nature of early Christianity. In Roman law, the household was governed by patria potestas, the absolute power of the father.
And when we say absolute, we mean absolute.
The male head of the household possessed total legal jurisdiction over his wife, his children, and his slaves. And this wasn't merely influential power, it was the power of life and death. The Latin term is vitae necisco potestas. He could legally execute a child or a slave without any trial.
Wow.
And when pagan philosophers like Aristotle wrote household codes, they exclusively addressed the subordinates. They told women, children, and slaves to submit in order to maintain the rigid social hierarchy. Aristotle famously defined a slave as nothing more than a living tool.
It's just brutal. And Paul comes in and completely upends this framework from the inside out. He maintains an ordered structure, but he addresses both sides of every single relationship.
Yes. The sheer act of addressing slaves directly in a moral exhortation was historically shocking. By instructing them on how to behave, Paul was acknowledging them as autonomous moral agents with dignity.
Completely contradicting their legal status as property.
Exactly. Furthermore, he subverts the Roman power dynamic by installing Jesus Christ as the ultimate, supreme master over the entire household.
He tells husbands they must love their wives and not be harsh with them, which strips away the tyrannical edge of patria potestas. He commands fathers not to provoke or embitter their children. And most radically, he looks directly at the Roman masters and commands them to treat their slaves justly and fairly, delivering this chilling reminder. knowing that you also have a master in heaven.
He drains the poison of exploitation right out of the social structure. He replaces it with Christological mutuality and self-giving love.
Because the entire power dynamic is relativized by the lordship of Christ.
Exactly. Everyone in the household is ultimately answering to the exact same heavenly master, which destroys any justification for earthly tyranny.
Which brings us to a massive pedagogical takeaway highlighted in these MDiv notes. It is a principle absolutely vital for understanding biblical ethics: identity before duty.
Oh, this is the crux of the whole thing.
You cannot approach someone and simply demand they stop being angry or command them to treat their spouse with self-sacrificial love. That is presenting duty in a vacuum.
It doesn't work.
If you enforce duty without establishing identity, you will inevitably crush the person under the weight of guilt because they will fail. Or conversely, you will manufacture a self-righteous Pharisee who falsely believes they are achieving perfection through their own willpower.
Teaching the imperatives, the commands to act, without firmly grounding them in the indicatives, the truths of what God has already accomplished, is disastrous. It is the very definition of legalism.
And notice the structure of Colossians here. Paul spends 2 dense chapters meticulously forging the believer's identity. He reminds them, you are chosen, you are holy, you are beloved, your record of debt has been canceled, the demonic powers accusing you have been paraded in chains, your life is permanently hidden with Christ in God.
He saturates them in it.
Right. And only after completely saturating them in the reality of their unbreakable new identity does he pivot and say, therefore, based entirely on who you already are, put to death the sin in your life. Identity must always serve as the rocket fuel for duty.
Amen. That's exactly right.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the Colossian letter, the journey we've traced is just astounding. We started in the ideological blender of the Lycus Valley, surrounded by a community crippled by this syncretistic anxiety that Jesus simply wasn't enough to protect them from the cosmos.
And we watched Paul, chained to a Roman guard, completely dismantle that terror.
He didn't offer a 10-step program. He offered the staggering, unassailable cosmic supremacy of Jesus Christ. He hijacked the false teacher's vocabulary to prove Christ is the pleroma. He wove together the entire Old Testament to prove Christ is the ultimate icon and the prototokos.
He detailed the brutal legal mechanics of the cross to prove the record of debt is obliterated and the cosmic accusers are permanently disarmed.
We do not need to chase shadows. We possess the eternal substance. And that high, majestic theology crashes down into our everyday reality, organically transforming how we dress our minds, how we treat our spouses, and how we view our identity.
It is an exhaustive, breathtaking vision of reality that forces a direct evaluation of our own lives, honestly. It asks the central question, are we genuinely trusting in the total sufficiency of Christ, or are we secretly searching for our own little spiritual supplements to justify ourselves and secure our standing?
It's a heavy question. And building on that, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to process as you go about your week. It concerns the radical elevation of ordinary secular life.
Let's hear it.
In Colossians 3:2-3:24, Paul issues a command specifically to the workers, the laborers. He writes, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ.
It changes everything.
Consider how completely that annihilates the divide between sacred and secular work. Regardless of your earthly vocation, whether you are writing code, sweeping hospital floors, managing an executive team, or wrangling toddlers at home, regardless of who signs your paycheck or how mundane the task feels, Paul asserts that your daily labor can be transfigured into an act of cosmic worship directed to the supreme creator of the universe.
Wow.
When your alarm goes off, and the reality of a Tuesday morning hits, think about what it would look like to step into your day, not as an exhausted drone serving a human boss, but as a resurrected person serving the Lord of the cosmos. Think about how that redefines your purpose tomorrow.